For decades now, we've been told to reduce our salt intake because high salt intake causes high blood pressure. We've been told too much salt is not good for our blood pressure, so reduce intake, and there's no real lower limit to how far you can go with this for the benefit to be seen. But maybe, just maybe, we've been blaming the wrong thing. See, salt intake across a population, across the world, has not significantly changed throughout this time. The world's population stubbornly sits at around about 3 to 4 grams per day, pretty much mid-range of what's considered normal salt intake, despite all the encouragement for us to eat less salt. And yet throughout that time, the incidence of blood pressure and high blood pressure and hypertension has been steadily increasing. So it does beg the question whether salt is really the thing that's to blame. Now, science gets a little bit tricky because it's really easy to see a correlation between two things, salt increase causing blood pressure increase, and assume that it's the cause. So correlation doesn't always equal causation. And let me explain. I want to give you a little example that makes this easier to understand. If you take a sample of the Australia and New Zealand population and compare how well they can read to their height, you'll discover something really interesting. You will discover that taller people can read better than shorter people. So height is correlated with reading ability. But this would be a completely wrong conclusion to jump to, because it's nothing to do with the height of the individual and everything to do with the fact that babies can't read. So it's actually nothing to do with height at all. It's everything to do with age. But if you looked at it, if you mapped that out, you would see this direct linear relationship between height and reading ability because of that skewing. And it makes us kind of think a little bit more carefully about what we're seeing with the salt thing as well. Is salt really the thing that's driving the blood pressure increase when salt intake hasn't really appreciably changed, despite the fact that hypertension is on the rise? And what's really interesting is if we start getting deeper into the science, and there's more and more research coming out on this now, what's starting to be seen is that there's what's called a J-shaped curve when it comes to sodium intake and hypertension. So in the middle of the J-shaped curve, which is like this, we see this sweet spot where around about the 3 to 4 grams of salt intake, these people tend to have the lowest blood pressure and the least risk of cardiovascular disease. If we go right to the extreme end of it, salt intake above sort of 6 grams, 7 grams a day, we see an increased risk of hypertension and cardiovascular disease risk. But if we go to the bottom end, which has not been kind of researched until more recently, we start to see a bit of a trend where very, very low sodium intake, below 3 grams a day, is actually also associated with increased blood pressure and increased cardiovascular disease risk. So it's not a case of less being good and as low as you can go being better. It's a case of there's a spot in the middle where we do best as humans when it comes to salt. And I think this is tied to the fact that salt is actually an essential nutrient. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but salt is actually something that our body does need. And so there's this curve where a certain amount of salt is a good thing. Now, we've worked with a ton of clients inside Body Reset now who have successfully lowered their blood pressure, and some of them have even been able to come off medications entirely. And we don't necessarily recommend that they're lowering their salt. Instead, what we're looking at is changing their nutrition and their meal structure to manage blood sugar and insulin levels. So we're doing it through nutrition and lifestyle changes to manage blood sugar and insulin. So let's look at this a little bit closer, because maybe this is the missing piece. If we look at the studies into people that develop hypertension or high blood pressure, what we see is that high insulin and insulin resistance is actually a predictor of developing hypertension in the future. So even if you don't have high blood pressure yet, if you have insulin resistance, it's incredibly likely that you will develop hypertension in the next 3 or 4 years as a result of the insulin resistance. There's a lot of other studies as well that show that actually directly reducing sugar intake also correlates with a drop in blood pressure, and this is because of the effect that it has on insulin. And then there's other studies as well that show that people with already high blood pressure, high blood sugar, and high insulin levels and insulin resistance have a much more dramatic response to higher salt intake in their diet. So the salt is absolutely playing a factor, but it's It's a problem because of the sugar, because of the insulin resistance in the first place. And one of insulin's primary roles on the kidneys is to cause the reabsorption of sodium. So what happens is you eat sugar, carbohydrates, you get high blood sugar levels, which means you then get a high insulin response. Insulin acts on the kidneys to reabsorb sodium so that you have more sodium in your body, which means you hold on to more water, so you've got more blood volume, which increases your blood pressure. And again, you could say, well, drop the sodium out and your blood pressure will come down, and it probably will, but is salt actually the problem, or was it the fact that the blood sugar was high in the first place? And so maybe reducing the salt is simply a patch fix for something that would be root cause dealt with if we dealt with the sugar issues in the first place. And I think it's really interesting if you think about it as well, when we know, well, salt intake hasn't significantly changed over the last couple of decades as hypertension has been on the rise, but sugar increase, on the other hand, has steadily and consistently risen across, the world's population. And a lot of the foods that are very high in, salt, and the ones which would be targeted if we were looking at reducing salt intake, are foods that are also really high in sugars, the processed foods and whatnot. And very often these two things come together. And so it's easy to kind of point the gun at salt and say, you are the problem, when actually maybe it's sugar that's really causing the bigger issues. And I mentioned before that salt is an essential nutrient. There's actually a lot of really important functions in the body for salt. Our blood is supposed to be salty. Salt is really important for cell connection, flow of nutrients into and out of cells, our ability to produce energy from our cells, neuron connection, and all that sort of stuff. And if you get very low on salt, it is a life-threatening condition, and you have a lot of side effects on the way to that. So, dizziness, faintness, all those sorts of things. There's unpleasant side effects when our body is too low on salt, because it is an essential nutrient for us. Sugar, on the other hand, is not an essential nutrient. In fact, you can go very low with sugar intake and there's only beneficial effects, because our body will regulate and can produce enough glucose within ourselves to be able to keep our blood sugar levels stable without needing to get it from a dietary source. Salt, on the other hand, we have to be getting enough of it in. So it kind of does seem a little bit short-sighted to blame salt for what sugar's doing when we could look at sugar intake in the first place. So if you are going to continue eating sugar and keeping your insulin high and all those sorts of things, then absolutely the best advice would be probably you should be looking at keeping your salt a little bit lower, because the chances are that your body doesn't have the capacity to deal with that extra salt because of what it's dealing with the sugar. Remember those studies that showed that people that have high blood sugar have a much more dramatic response to salt. So if you're not going to tidy up your diet, then the best recommendation is what is being recommended, and that is to reduce your salt intake. But if you truly want to get at the root of the issue, then we have to look at the sugar. And this is what we do through Body Reset. We've got a whole lot of resources that are really targeted towards nutrition and lifestyle tweaks to manage blood sugar and insulin levels. And this is the root cause stuff that then helps to improve hypertension, blood pressure, helps to improve cholesterol levels, helps to improve weight loss, energy, brain health, sleep, all of these different things. So if you want some ideas, some information to get started on this, comment guide below and we'll send you our 5 top trainings that gives you a whole lot of information to get started on something that's actually going to make a really decent difference to your blood pressure, and not just patch fix by reducing salt and making your food boring. Hopefully helpful, guys, getting you thinking. Have a brilliant day. See ya.